So I'm going to hand over to David Anderson now. He's going to speak to us on the title he gave us was Barzini's question, United Europe and the United Kingdom. Thank you very much, David.
Well, thank you very much, Maurice. I've actually just given a copy of this report to the European University Institute. Of course, you can find it online. It was debated last week in the United Kingdom Parliament, and I think the best advice that was given to members of Parliament came from Emily Thornberry MP, who said, "My advice to honourable members about this report is don't drop it on your foot." Well, I was doing that in an entirely independent capacity. In fact, when I was asked to be the independent reviewer of terrorism law, the three very secret men who came to ask me if I would do it asked if I was in any cases connected with terrorism. And I said, yes, but you won't like the answer. I represent Mr. Cardi. Your government thinks he's an old friend of Osama bin Laden, and you're trying to freeze his assets. Oh, we knew about that one, they said, but there aren't any others? No? Good. In that case, you can have the job. Well, terrorism and surveillance have, for the past 4 years, taken nearly all the intellectual energy I have. But engrossing as they are, they scarcely seemed suitable for an address to your summer school. Anyway, I have lectured on them in the past, and you can find those lectures on my website. I'd be very happy to field questions on either subject at the end. And I see from your biographies that we have some experts in the audience. I thought today I would try something a bit different, and perhaps a little parochial, to go back to my old stamping ground and reflect a little on the troublesome relationship between my own country and Europe. My excuse for doing so is the recent election result in the United Kingdom, which means that there will be a referendum in or before 2017 on whether the UK should remain a member of the European Union. There will be some law in my address, but on a day as hot as this, not very much. These are dramatic times for Europe. Waves of migrants fleeing unimaginable hardship in the Middle East and Africa demonstrate the inability of the Union to control its external frontier. Asylum seekers are not allocated between the member states in a balanced and equitable manner, but driven by successive Dublin regulations to the countries of southern and eastern Europe where they first entered the Union. An unfairness which is mitigated not by balancing rules, but by unfairnesses of a different kind. Failures in some gateway states to register them properly, rendering less likely their return. Or, more seriously still, failures to observe the fundamental rights guaranteed by the Refugee Convention and by the Union's own charter, rendering such return legally impermissible. Meanwhile, there is a crisis in the Eurozone for which the overused metaphor Greek tragedy is scarcely sufficient. Whether you see current events as inevitable retribution for feckless behaviour, or as the cruel subordination of democracy to the power of capital, the anxiety and suffering of EU citizens cannot be denied, and we find ourselves in uncharted economic and political waters. To vary the metaphor, the then Conservative Party leader William Hague's prediction from 1998 that the euro would turn into a burning building with no exits seems less exaggerated than once it did, at least from across the English Channel. No one can reliably predict whether Greece will stay in the euro or indeed the European Union, describe what conditions its people will face 5 years from now, or guarantee that the contagion will not spread further. Both these vital matters, of course, were discussed at the European Council last Friday, one in a long series of high-level summits. But they were not the only item on the agenda. For the first time in the formal setting of an EU summit, the United Kingdom, through its Prime Minister David Cameron, put forward its plans for the renegotiation that is supposed to precede the referendum to be held next year or in 2017 on continued British membership of the European Union. One diplomat who was present described the moment as follows: there was a very emotional discussion on migration, and David Cameron gave us a commercial break. The Prime Minister's intervention is said to have lasted between 8 and 10 minutes, and there was no response from any of the other 27 EU heads of government. He said afterwards, "It has been a long night, and we've discussed some very important subjects, but above all, I'm delighted that the process of British reform and renegotiation and the referendum that we are going to hold, that process is now properly underway." That delight was not shared by members of his own party back home, including the Mayor of London, who were busy setting him up to fail. They have told us that we should vote to leave the Union if Mr. Cameron does not achieve such manifestly unachievable goals as a national parliamentary veto over all EU law. Well, going back a little way into the history of our continent, it is not difficult to find resounding endorsements of the European ideal, even from British politicians. In 1943, as the Second World War raged, Winston Churchill broadcast publicly about how to achieve what he described as the largest common measure of the integrated life of Europe that is possible, without destroying the individual characteristics and traditions of its many ancient and historic races. In his famous Zurich speech of December 1946, Churchill said, "We must recreate the European family in a regional structure called, as it may be, the United States of Europe." Though, as usually, though not invariably, appeared to be the case, his vision for the United Kingdom was as a friend and sponsor of the new Europe, rather than a core member. Ernest Bevin, the Labour Foreign Secretary, just after the war, when asked in London what his foreign policy was, revealed himself to be a Schengenite avant la lettre. "I have only one," he said. "It is to go down to Victoria Station here, take a ticket, and go where the hell I like without anybody pulling me up with a passport." Harold Macmillan, whose attempt to take the UK into the community as Prime Minister was met by the first of de Gaulle's 2 vetoes in 1963, in later life put the case for Europe as powerfully and as lyrically as any continental visionary has done. "We argue," he said, "about fish, about potatoes, about milk on the periphery. But what is Europe really for? Because the countries of Europe, none of them anything but second-rate powers by themselves, can, if they get together, be a power in the world, an economic power, a power in foreign policy, a power in defence, equal to either of the superpowers. We are in the position of the Greek city-states. They fought one another, and they fell victim to Alexander the Great and then to the Romans. Europe united could still, by not haggling about the size of lorries, but by having a single foreign policy, a single defence policy, and a single economic policy, be equal to the great superpowers." 3 months after those words were written, in 1979, Margaret Thatcher began her 11-year premiership. Though now remembered in Europe chiefly for her fierce budgetary battles and her resistance to what she called a European superstate, she was a proponent of a stronger and more unified European foreign policy, and appointed as Commissioner Lord Cofield, the cool Cartesian who, together with Jacques Delors, pushed through the almost 300 measures that were deemed necessary in order to create the internal market by the 31st of December 1992. Here I slow down a little because I become, in my own small way, an eyewitness. Blessed during my education with exchange visits to France and Germany, spells of work in France, Germany, and Greece, and a first degree in European history, it made sense to add practical experience to my studies of European law. So I headed to Brussels. It was my good fortune to work as a stagiaire in the Commissioner's private office, in that time of the Commission's greatest influence and success. Cofield was motivated by an unshakable faith in Europe as an agent for peace. He took time every Armistice Day to visit the grave of his father, who had been killed in the First World War. And I think he believed also in the eventual evolution of that beautiful concept, visible here in Bruges and in Brussels, but rather more elusive elsewhere, the European demos. Cofield was concerned that some of us, to whom it fell to draft answers to parliamentary questions, had not always treated the European Parliament with the respect that it deserved. He summoned us to his office at New Year 1988, and he told us that just as the absolutist King Charles I had to cede control to the English Parliament, so we must realise that the Commission would someday be fully accountable to the voice of the people of Europe, as expressed through the European Parliament in Strasbourg. He didn't mention the word Spitzkandidaten, but I suppose it was the sort of thing he was anticipating. Coming back to England later that year, I encountered an interest in the European project that I have not experienced either before or since. For the right, Europe stood at last for effective liberalisation, personified by Lord Cofield. And Delors, the French socialist, had won over the left, which had always been suspicious of the project but was sick of Mrs. Thatcher, with the emergence of social Europe. If you were starting a small business at that time in London, there was a fair chance, incredible though it seems today, that you would call it the Euro Dry Cleaners or the Euro Café and decorate your sign with yellow stars on a blue background. And that interest and enthusiasm increased when the Berlin Wall came down in November 1989. Already married for 2 months to the girl I had met in Brussels, and she sits at the back today, we watched with awe and excitement on our little television as the pickaxes were swung and the cheering people flooded through. Only the previous year, Mrs. Thatcher had said in her famous speech at the College of Europe in Bruges, "We must never forget that east of the Iron Curtain, people who once enjoyed a full share of European culture, freedom, and identity have been cut off from their roots. We shall always look on Warsaw, Prague, and Budapest as great European cities." The cities she mentioned at the time seemed hidden and mysterious. And her sentiment, shame on my generation, for whom the Iron Curtain had seemed an immovable fact of life, almost eccentric. With intoxicating suddenness, it was becoming a reality. And how extraordinary to think that for all its apparent permanence, the Berlin Wall only stood for 28 years. Curiosity about the European project spilled over even into those bastions of cool reflection, the courts. I saw it myself in 2 of the cases that Maurice mentioned, Tame and Sunday trading. The Tame case was a legal challenge to an Act of Parliament, promised just before an election. The Act sought to restrict the ownership of British fishing vessels to United Kingdom citizens domiciled and resident in the United Kingdom. Justification was claimed for this in international law as it related to the flagging of vessels. But the unlawful discrimination inherent in this act seemed clear to my clients, Spaniards who had purchased British fishing vessels from British fishermen and who used them to develop new fishing grounds and to land types of fish not, at that time, commonly eaten in the UK. In the absence of a constitutional court, Acts of Parliament had been considered inviolable in the United Kingdom for almost 400 years. But encouraged by the European Court of Justice, from which 3 preliminary rulings were obtained, the English courts first suspended the Act on an interim basis, then set it aside, then awarded substantial damages to the fishermen for the period of time they had been unable to earn their livelihood. The case did more than any other to bring home to law students and to the general public the primacy of EU law. What was striking to me was the matter-of-fact way in which the British judges proceeded at all levels of the court system. Politics didn't come into it. They read the law as it was contained in judgments of the Court of Justice and acted on it as they thought was right. If Tame was litigation on the grand scale, then Sunday trading cases were a cottage industry. The law in England used to forbid the opening of most shops on Sundays, and the do-it-yourself chain B&Q was prosecuted for breaking the law. Relying on the simple proposition that shops which are open sell more than shops which are closed. B&Q resisted the prosecutions on the basis that the obligation to close resulted in a reduction of imports from other member states and could not be objectively justified. In the first reference to be decided by the Court of Justice, the Court ruled that the right to free movement of goods could be infringed by Sunday trading rules, but only if the restrictive effects on community trade exceeded the effects intrinsic to rules of that kind. On the basis of that Delphic formulation, it was argued in subsequent proceedings with mixed success that the national rule was indeed unsustainable. The fashion grew and spread to other member states. Eventually, after a series of further references, the Court of Justice ruled in the case of Keck that selling arrangements would infringe the free movement rules only, in effect, where they were aimed at products from other member states. By then, the English law had been changed anyway, in part because of the incessant legal challenges. But the case taught us another lesson, that we could be instrumental in changing not just English law, but European law as well. European lawyers were active not only in the courts, but in law schools around the continent. Students from all over Europe flocked to British universities to be instructed in European law by people like Maurice Cremona, if they were lucky, or myself. Something they are still doing, incidentally. Though if my own subjective observations are anything to go by, both their fellow students and their teachers, rather like the tennis players at Wimbledon or the footballers in the English Premier League, are drawn increasingly, indeed almost exclusively, from countries other than the UK. After the wall came down, something very unusual happened. The British, or some of them, became evangelists for Europe. Judges and lawyers, often led or influenced by the brilliant, witty and charismatic European court judge Gordon Slynn, travelled the length and breadth of the continent, bringing European law à l'anglaise to the benighted folk of Finland, Albania, and all places in between. Many of us have happy memories of these slightly anarchic expeditions. Slynn sprinkling stardust on Supreme Court justices and packed halls of students alike, his juniors filling in the detail, his wife visiting the local prison, then all of us repairing to a Hungarian opera, a Latvian biker's cafe, or the reception which Lord Slynn had persuaded the ambassador to provide. And our ideals were nourished by the people we met. In the months after Estonia won her independence from the Soviet Union, a number of us were invited on a Saturday afternoon to the new offices of Estonia's first independent law firm, where we were proudly greeted by what seemed to be almost the entire membership of the Estonian bar, some of them recent veterans of the singing revolution. Taped to the walls by way of decoration were photocopies of Magna Carta and the Declaration of Independence. And set into the great wooden partners' table was a brass plaque engraved with the miraculous words Pacta sunt servanda. The rule of law had arrived, a common body of principles was spreading across the continent, and we felt privileged to be there at the birth of something so exciting, so new, and so important. One has to be careful when looking back to one's own youth to allow for the ever-present possibility that memories may be rose-tinted. But so far as my country is concerned, that period in the late 1980s and early 1990s looks like a period, if not of enthusiasm, then at least of untypical openness to the concept of European integration. The point was not so much that the process was loved, this has never been the case, as that it seemed for a while irreversible. And as Jean Monnet is said to have observed, although I have never succeeded in tracking down the reference, the English resist ideas, but they do not resist facts. At this point, I suspend my narrative and ask a question. What happened to take us from the happy picture I have painted, with I hope not too much exaggeration, of Lord Cockfield, Sunday trading, and the singing revolution, to the depressing snapshot with which I started, a European Council facing humanitarian, even existential catastrophes, which it seemed unable or unwilling to resolve, while the Union itself is threatened by Grexit, Brexit, and after that, who knows what. In seeking to answer that question, I would start by observing that the decline in British acceptance of the European construct over the past quarter of a century mirrors a trend which is to be observed across the continent. In the spring of 1991, 71% of EU citizens thought that their country's membership of the EU was a good thing, as opposed to only 47% 20 years later. Idealism perhaps is in short supply around the continent, and self-interest, particularly since the crash of 2008, very much to the fore. Eurobarometer surveys prove that the British are unenthusiastic Europeans, but their divergence from the norm is sometimes less than may be imagined. So, for example, asked at the end of 2014 whether the EU had a positive effect on life in Europe, 45% of the British thought so, as against an EU average of only 49%. And in the UK, as elsewhere, younger and better educated people had a noticeably more positive view of the EU than others. There are some more marked differences. The British are unusual, along with the Swedes, the Dutch, and the Germans, in placing a higher level of trust in their national governments than in the EU. And asked whether they felt like citizens of the EU, only 50% of the British said yes, against an EU average of 63%. These figures describe, to some extent, the uncomfortable nature of Britain's relationship with the EU. But to explain it, we have to look for the factors that lie behind those figures. One factor that I believe can immediately be discounted is the idea that the British have lower than average levels of liking for their fellow Europeans. It is true that our language skills are often woeful, and that school exchanges and town twinning are sadly in decline. But there is no shortage of willingness to appreciate the way that other European countries manage things, whether that means the high-speed trains of France, the safe cyclists of the Netherlands, the television dramas of Scandinavia, or the hard work and enterprise so frequently displayed by fellow Europeans who have chosen to make their lives in the UK. Paradoxically, perhaps, prominent Eurosceptics often have close personal ties with Europe. The politicians Michael Portillo and Gisela Stuart, both born in other European countries. Nigel Farage, leader of the UK Independence Party, who does not like hearing foreign languages on trains, but has a German wife. And the arch-sceptic Owen Paterson, until recently a cabinet minister, former president of the European Tanners Confederation, and a fluent French and German speaker. Each maintain that they appreciate Europeans and Europe, reserving their hostility for the structures of the European Union. And on that, at least, I think we can believe them. Another factor that we can more or less discount, in my opinion, is the work of the Court of Justice of the European Union. When one considers the political travails of the last 50 or 60 years, the manner in which that court has earned the respect of its national counterparts, upon which it largely relies for the enforcement of its judgments, seems to me remarkable. Its rulings, though somewhat robotic in style, command at least a grudging respect, even when adverse rulings are delivered in cases of the highest national importance. Allow me once again to digress into personal experience. It is taken from a low point in British relations with Europe, the so-called beef war of 1996, when concern over the EU's reaction to mad cow disease, culminating in a ban on British exports of beef, had caused the British government to introduce a policy of non-cooperation at European meetings. They didn't leave an empty chair, they just folded their arms and didn't say anything. The wisdom of that policy, forced on the Prime Minister by the strength of Eurosceptic opinion in Parliament, was questionable. It seemed, at any rate, an unpromising background for an application to the Court of Justice for the suspension of the ban, and the application duly failed. But no one present in court or reading the judgments could have gone away with the impression that this was a political decision. After politely tolerating the formal speeches, the juge rapporteur, the brilliant Judge Sivone, got down to business with a long series of acute technical questions that demonstrated beyond any doubt that the court was approaching these issues in exactly the right spirit of dispassionate inquiry. And as the UK was subsequently reminded, you win some and you lose some. After the EU lifted its ban, France was said to be slow in complying, and the court agreed. French advocates can be among the most able performers in the Court of Justice, as indeed are their administrators in negotiation. But the French government had slipped up. It granted permission for British beef to be exhibited at an international trade fair in France, hoping thereby to deflect the argument that it was preventing beef from being delivered to third countries. But it granted the permission in a letter which required British exhibitors to ensure that their beef was either destroyed, returned to the United Kingdom, or consumed within the British Embassy in Paris. That was what we advocates refer to as an open goal. At the oral hearing, we expressed our gratitude to the French for acknowledging that British beef was safe for consumption by British diplomats, and asked the court to confirm that it was safe also for the other inhabitants of France. There is great camaraderie between advocates at the Court of Justice, and such little amusements are an agreeable way of humanising the sometimes rather dry subject matter of the cases. I do not wish to sound uncritical about the work of the court. A frequent criticism of it, sometimes valid in my opinion, is a tendency to overstep the bounds of judicial interpretation by venturing into the treacherous field of judicial legislation. We probably each have our favourite examples. Mine is the decision of the court in the aviation case Sturgeon, affirmed by the Grand Chamber in 2012 in my own case of TUI. In those cases, the court interpreted the denied boarding regulations as providing compensation for flights that had been delayed, as well as flights that had been cancelled, notwithstanding that this possibility had been specifically raised and rejected during the legislative process. This tendency offends lawyers of an orthodox cast of mind, particularly when they are on the losing side. I would say that it verges on the anti-democratic. But public visibility of the court is low, and it would be wrong to say that such matters have a significant impact on opinion in the UK, or I suspect in any other member state. The United Kingdom courts have been generally loyal over the years to EU jurisprudence, but there was a potentially significant departure last year in the HS2 case, in which they took issue with the approach of two advocates general, one of them ironically British, in cases concerning the Environmental Impact Directive, Boxus and Normachiaiki. We have an expert here on that too. The Advocates General had demanded close scrutiny by national judges of the legislative process to see whether the people's elected representatives had been able properly to examine and debate the proposal, or had performed their democratic function correctly and efficiently. To perform such an exercise, said the Supreme Court, would have put British judges in breach of the Bill of Rights 1689, a constitutional statute which precludes the impeaching or questioning in any court of debates or proceedings in Parliament. This led the court to say for the first time, in the first authoritative British equivalent of the Solange judgments of the Bundesverfassungsgericht, it is, putting the point at its lowest, certainly arguable, and it is for United Kingdom law and courts to determine, that there may be fundamental principles, whether contained in other constitutional instruments or recognised at common law, of which Parliament, when it enacted the European Communities Act 1972, did not either contemplate or authorise the abrogation. In other words, it is conceivable, though it has not yet happened, that the primacy of European law may founder upon constitutional principles interpreted by United Kingdom judges. But I have digressed, and once again, these are matters of concern to constitutional lawyers, more perhaps than to the general public. If I had to identify 5 factors that have contributed to the current disenchantment with Europe in Britain, I would mention these: Britain's conception of its place in the world, its self-exclusion from important parts of the European project, the impact of specific policies and freedoms, a media hostile to European integration, and cowardly politicians. Let me say a word about each. The first is the issue of Britain's place in the world. I don't mean by this continued nostalgia for empire. It was certainly once the case that the British felt the loss of their empire, rather as one is supposed to feel an arm even after it has been amputated. Indeed, post-imperial ties were a significant part of the reason why the UK was slow to join the European Economic Community. When it was suggested in 1952 that Britain should join a federation on the continent of Europe, Anthony Eden, Foreign Secretary and later Prime Minister, commented that this was something we know in our bones we cannot do. But this, I think, is no longer a factor of real significance. Family links remain, particularly with the old Commonwealth, where nearly everybody has at least one friend or relative. But things have moved on. Current attitudes to empire are represented best, I think, by the much photographed statues of Nelson Mandela and Mahatma Gandhi, liberators of their people from British rule, which stand in pride of place just opposite the Houses of Parliament. Rather, I mean pride in a history which is often perceived in the United Kingdom as a series of successful attempts to defend itself, and sometimes others, from overweening European power, whether exercised in the name of the Catholic Church or through the military might of Napoleon or Hitler. For too many people, the European Union fits that narrative. One would hope in this 200th anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo and 100th anniversary of the First World War that it is the advantages of collaboration rather than splendid isolation which would be drawn from that history. But the alliances that are spoken of with real affection, and those which in some respects remain the closest, are those with the English-speaking peoples of the world, an ever-present palliative for those who prefer not to focus on our geographical location. This is what de Gaulle meant when he is said to have remarked that faced with the choice between Europe and the open sea, Britain would always choose le grand large. His successor, Georges Pompidou, expressly renounced this view when he was eventually persuaded to allow Britain to join the community in 1973. And I believed myself that it was in retreat during the golden period that I have described 15 or 20 years later. But the old state of mind has proved very durable. It was well expressed by Luigi Barzini, the Italian journalist whose question is alluded to in the title of this lecture. In his book, The Europeans, he explained why the British, as he put it, missed the European bus, as follows. They did not really believe Europe was their business. Still today, when one asks a Briton, any Briton, are you European? The answer is always, European? Did you say European? A long, thoughtful pause in which all other continents are mentally evoked and regretfully discarded. Yes, of course I'm European. This admission is pronounced without pride and with resignation. The second and paradoxical reason that I would give for growing disenchantment is Britain's self-exclusion from important parts of the European project. There is a long history of this, dating back to the Spark Committee meetings of 1955, which eventuated in the Treaty of Rome, but to which the sole British delegate was a minor trade official, Russell Bretherton. Bretherton was eventually summoned home on the basis that Britain should have no part in what a more senior civil servant described as this mysticism which appeals to European Catholic federalists. Interviewed in later life about the experience, Bretherton observed, "If we had been able to say that we agreed in principle, we could have got any kind of common market we wanted. I have no doubt of that at all." Most people would now acknowledge that British non-participation in the formation of the original communities was, at least from a British point of view, an historic mistake. Even today, it fuels distrust of the whole project. The EU, in sharp contrast to NATO and even the Council of Europe, in which the UK took a major role in setting up, is perceived as essentially Gallic in its structures and un-British in its functioning. Hierarchy and protocol are thought to count for more than they do at home. You might think it would have helped that English has now become the primary language of the institutions, with the notable exception of the Court of Justice. But the past quarter of a century has seen a decline in talented British civil servants wishing to make a life in Brussels, and there are perennial difficulties in recruiting Britons to the European civil service. There is irony in the fact that the supposedly alien bureaucracy of the EU has been rejected in Britain, just as the French, or some of them, have themselves become disenchanted with an EU which they perceive as having been taken over by Anglo-Saxon free marketeers. Further exclusions have followed, once again entirely self-imposed, from the Schengen area, from the Euro, from which the United Kingdom has a permanent opt-out, and from elements of justice and home affairs, now freedom, security and justice. The UK-Polish Protocol on the Charter of Fundamental Rights, misleadingly characterised by some as an opt-out, is a further example. These self-imposed exclusions are invariably supported by the population, particularly where the euro is concerned. It is common wisdom, at least in the United Kingdom, that a single currency cannot work without financial solidarity and, to support it, a high degree of political integration. As only a small minority of Britons wish to go down that road, future membership of the euro scarcely even registers on the political agenda. We shudder at unemployment levels in the south of Europe and reflect, whether accurately or not, that as members of the euro we could have found ourselves in the same place. It is mystifying to Britons that euro membership remains popular with a majority of the populations in most or even all eurozone states, and only marginally unpopular in most of the candidate states. Indeed, so one-sided is public opinion that polling companies in the UK rarely trouble even to ask the euro question. The last poll that I was able to find on this subject dates from 2012, in which 6% said they were in favour of euro membership, as against 81% who were against, the rest being unsure. I very much doubt that the 6% figure would be much larger today. So we can assume that if the United Kingdom were part of the euro, and indeed of Schengen, its current mood of scepticism would not be improved. But its removal from the centre of the European project has itself encouraged a sense of detachment. Treaty negotiators have, over the years, been adept at extricating the United Kingdom from elements of the European project. But the more this is done, the more Europe is perceived as a project for others rather than for us. And the further the UK moves from the intellectual and policy-making heart of the European movement, the less attractive the governance of Europe becomes as a place where ambitious and intelligent young people want to make their mark. The same is true, I'm afraid, even in the law. At my chambers in London, where I chaired the recruitment committee for many years, candidates routinely express their passion for public law, international law, human rights law, commercial law, and even competition law, but only rarely now for European law. This lack of enthusiasm feeds through into a significant underrepresentation of UK nationals in the European institutions, including in particular, and very sadly, the Court of Justice. The third factor in British disillusionment with the European project is disillusionment with specific policies. Progress towards a single market is seen as painfully slow, particularly where services are concerned. The perception, rightly or wrongly, is that lucrative British industries such as energy supply and rail transport have been opened to competition from other member states, but that this has not always been reciprocated. The common agricultural and fisheries policies, traditional targets of British Eurosceptics, figure perhaps less prominently on the scale of grievances than was once the case. After all, agricultural spending as a proportion of the EU budget has fallen from 70% in 1985 to less than 40% today. And there have been recent improvements to the fisheries policy, though there is still resentment of the way in which it was hurriedly cobbled together in the period immediately prior to UK accession, with the apparent aim of giving access to the fleets of other member states to the historic fishing grounds of the UK industry. But the greatest concern today for many people is the issue of immigration. The United Kingdom was a strong proponent of enlarging the European Union to the east, and was surely on the right side of that argument. It was one of only a very few member states to open its doors to workers from Poland and other accession states in advance of its obligation to do so. But predictions of migration levels, which I think at one stage were put at about 6,000 a year from the 8 accession states, have consistently proved to be huge underestimates. Eurobarometer tells us that 38% of the British population considers immigration to be one of the 2 most important issues facing their member state at the moment, a figure matched only in Denmark, Germany and Malta. Of course, much of that concern relates to immigration from third countries. And it is true also that Britons exercise their right to work and to retire in other member states. But net immigration is currently running at over 300,000 a year, including net immigration from the EU of 180,000 per year. These are figures that require the construction of the equivalent of a substantial new city every year. And as those of you who know England are aware, the south of the country, where people mainly want to live, is already one of the most densely populated regions of Europe. Few Britons are racist and most value the contribution that immigrants make to our economy, but many find it disorienting and unsatisfactory to live through such an unprecedented period of change. Of course, these figures may be influenced by temporary factors, notably high unemployment in the south of Europe and the relatively healthy jobs market in the UK. But net immigration has exceeded 150,000 in every year since 1998 and is on an upward trend. The population has grown as much in the past 10 years as it did in the previous 40. And in sharp contrast to many other European countries, the rate of increase is projected to rise. If reports are to be believed, the government recognises that it is not politically feasible to secure any kind of modification of the basic treaty right to free movement. Its efforts in the renegotiation appear rather to be focused on limiting initial eligibility for in-work benefits. But even if such measures could be agreed by our partners, and on first hearing they have a discriminatory feel to them, they would do nothing to reduce the feeling of powerlessness over the vital national issue of border control. People look with envy to countries like Australia, which can choose the number and qualifications of migrants to suit their own needs. Law-abiding European migrants are not resented, but the inability to control the level of migration or to plan for it, I'm afraid, is. The fourth of my factors is a media largely hostile to European integration. I don't want to exaggerate the importance of this. There is no anti-European bias in broadcasting, so far as I can see, only in parts of what used to be known as the print media. And there is also the question of chicken and egg. No paper will sell copies by promoting views that its readers find distasteful. But a number of widely read newspapers have for decades been misrepresenting the European project and spreading Euro myths, usually relating to alleged proposals by the Commission to interfere in everyday life, or the tendency of other member states to apply the rules less strictly than we believe we do ourselves. This tendency shows no sign of diminishing. Let me give you a few headlines from the past 3 months alone. Europe bans tourist photos of the London Eye. Brussels is trying to restrict the drinking habits of Britain's coffee lovers. Fury at EU plot to tax Britain. EU orders organic farmers to use homeopathic medicine on their animals, apparently not on themselves. And a couple of festive headlines from last Christmas. Christmas deliveries put at risk by EU. And EU ruling gobbles up Christmas dinner. Both apparently a reference to new rules requiring additional training for lorry drivers. In case you think I've taken those headlines from the sort of papers you find free outside public toilets, I should tell you that the last two come respectively from the Times and the Sunday Times. The EU has a rather witty webpage dedicated to debunking such stories, but I doubt it is read by more than a tiny proportion of those who read the offending papers. Even knowledgeable and influential public figures join in. The Times again published an article last week by the moderate conservative Matthew Parris, a former diplomat and MP, entitled "The EU is Doomed Whether We Stay or Go." Mr. Parris started by declaring himself to be not a Eurosceptic, but a Europhobe. He spoke of his aversion, when he'd been a diplomat, to his colleagues' silky-tongued disregard for mere democracy as they worshipped in the temples of the Berlaymont and spoke in a language of pillars and chapters, only nominally English, but with no meaning in English. Almost everything about the institution irritates, he added, from its bossy mandarins to its greedy MEPs to its indecisive heads of state, from its corruptions to its sniggering, winking rule-benders to its self-lunching grandiosity, from its head-in-the-sand aversion to hard decisions to its itch to regulate trivialities. Bossy, flabby, broken-backed and pompous, the European Union has a big yellow streak running right through it. Like the Holy Roman Empire, the organisation has become an overhang from the past into the future, and the future is eating away its foundations. Having heard that, it may surprise you to learn that he went on to advise voting yes in the forthcoming referendum, but on grounds which have nothing whatever to do with the clear-headed idealism of Harold Macmillan. As he concluded, "In short, it's probably best to string along with the EU for the time being, but I wouldn't go to the stake on it. Tens of millions of my fellow citizens think like this. But we're open to persuasion the other way, if Europe gets too big for its boots. Precisely because most of us don't feel all that strongly, the mood could flip." He was right at least about one thing, that as previous referenda in other countries and recent UK opinion polls have shown, electorates can indeed be volatile where European questions are concerned. But did these childish caricatures resonate with the readers of the United Kingdom's best-known establishment newspaper? I went below the line and read some of the many hundreds of comments on the online version of his article. Of the 20 most recommended comments, all written by apparently intelligent people, 9 agreed with him, praising his coherent and lucid approach. One, the 20th most recommended, took him to task for underestimating the prosperity and freedom that the EU has brought to Europe. The other 10 agreed with his Europhobic criticisms, but found them insufficient. They attacked the author for recommending a vote in favour of continued membership. As the most recommended comment of all put it, "If it is doomed to fail, are we not better off to jump before the ship sinks?" And here we come to the 5th and last of my explanations: cowardly politicians. The great majority of them are in favour of continued EU membership, but they dare not advance reasons for it going beyond mere self-interest, safeguarding jobs, cheaper holidays, reduction of roaming charges, and so on. The trouble with arguing in terms only of self-interest is that one is vulnerable to counterexamples of self-interest not being served. For example, the UK's sizable net contribution to the EU budget. The debate tends also to be couched, depressingly, in terms of protecting us from the things Europe wants to do, rather than on how we can influence Europe and, through Europe, the wider world. The public is told that the UK vetoed a treaty in 2011, when in fact 25 other member states shrugged their shoulders and then signed it anyway. Even European human rights are characterised as a threat to our traditions and our well-being. European law is more central to our national life than most politicians are prepared to allow. Perhaps they think that if they acknowledge that fact, we will disapprove. Or perhaps they delude themselves, clinging to the notion of national sovereignty without accepting that it can often be used more effectively in conjunction with others. Either way, the cumulative effect of ignoring or downplaying the importance of Europe is to render Europe dispensable in the national mind. It's a dangerous game to play. So what of the referendum? 4 quick points to end on. The first thing I would say is that the result is no foregone conclusion. Polls currently show a large majority in favour of continued membership, but the young who are most favourable are also the least likely to vote. And as recently as November 2012, 56% opposed membership, as against only 30% who wished to remain. The result of Mr Cameron's renegotiation has the potential to be quite influential on the outcome. The second thing I would say is that even if the British vote to stay in, they will not become Euro enthusiasts overnight. When the last referendum in 1975, 2 years after British accession, produced a victory for the yes camp, the then Home Secretary, Roy Jenkins, stated, "It puts the uncertainty behind us. It commits Britain to Europe. It commits us to playing an active, constructive and enthusiastic role in it." Those words, unfortunately, were not altogether borne out by history. Referenda, like elections, produce results, but they do not silence the losing side. Thirdly, and at the risk of perpetrating a heresy in this secular Vatican of European law, it may be time to recognise that even the concept of two-speed Europe, with its implication that all will eventually arrive at the same destination, is insufficiently flexible to accommodate the diverse aspirations of European states. In his excellent book, The Future of Europe, published in 2011, Jean-Claude Parris firmly dismissed the concept of Europe à la carte, which he defined as optional participation in policies falling outside a mandatory common core. "It will not be examined in this book," he wrote, "as it appears to go in a direction that is opposed to the very basic principles on which the EU is built." One disagrees reluctantly with such a brilliant lawyer and civil servant, but I would make two observations. First, is it not time to abandon the fiction that opt-outs must be only temporary? Indeed, has it not already been abandoned in the case not only of the opt-out kings, the United Kingdom and Denmark, but of the other European countries, Norway, Switzerland, which participate in some parts of the European project, but not in others? And secondly, life was not à la carte in the 1950s, but in almost every respect it is today. If the only restaurant in town requires its patrons to consume a standard menu, which some of them, however unaccountably, find unpalatable, then who could be surprised if at some stage they take the decision to eat at home instead? But finally, I do hope that will never happen. With barely 7% of the world's population and a declining relative share of its economy and its trade, Europe's best chance of future influence can only come from unity. As Benjamin Franklin said at the signing of the Declaration of Independence, we must all hang together, or assuredly, we must all hang separately. For all its imperfections, our union is the most advanced expression yet of the international rule of law, and thus a model to the world. And for all our imperfections, it is my fervent hope that the bloody Brits will find a way to be there for the long term, helping to develop both flexible ground rules for the peoples of our continent to live harmoniously together, and a framework for Europe to project itself to the outside world. Thank you very much.